few porn consumers actually intend or plan to have sex with porn actresses, much less with actresses or I can't read today, with actresses whose porn they consume. They only think about, imagine, or desire sex with the actresses. Thus, even if Matthew 28 is true, much porn consumption doesn't involve lustful intent, and so may not involve mental adultery.
And to which point, before we get started, I would say, now, Ben. Like, come on, dude. Like, come on now. It's just fellas talking. It's just me and you.
Hey there, this is Dylan from the Identity Crisis podcast. I'm with my co-host here, Jalen.
That's me.
That's him. So we came across an article recently. The article claims that Jesus was not against porn. It's a pretty provocative claim, and we're hoping to kind of analyze the arguments within the article, see how it weighs up against the biblical witness and the historicity and consistent interpretation amongst the church.
I think you left something out, though, broski. The idea of the article is, since Jesus wasn't against porn, he obviously must have been for it.
Ah, yes.
So because he didn't say anything against it, it must be okay.
And that's a classic argument fallacy.
Of course.
You know what it's called, right?
Nope, what is it?
It's an argument from silence.
Oh, we're familiar with those.
So if you, it's a very simple thing. Basically, since it wasn't said, they're therefore for it, or you can kind of twist the silence into your own agenda.
Sure.
Not saying the individual who wrote the article had negative intentions beyond that, but it's very clearly an argument from silence at the end of the day.
For sure.
So some of the things we're hoping to do today is just to kind of read Matthew in its context, analyze the arguments presented in the article from our friend Ben, and see if they hold any weight and kind of survey it against a biblical backdrop of sexual morality, survey modern scholarship, and what the church has thought overall throughout history on this topic. So one of the first things I'd like to do is just read the citation or read the biblical passage that the article is centered around to make the argument. And then we can kind of talk about a little bit what we think the passage means in and of itself, and then we can kind of zoom out from there on what the Bible says about sexual morality. Sound cool?
Let's do it.
All right. So this is from Matthew 5, verses 27 through 30. Excuse me there. It says, "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall not commit adultery.' But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. For it is better for you to lose one of your members than that your whole body be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. For it is better that you lose one of your members that your whole body go into hell." Oftentimes, the word hell is also translated as Gehenna as well, just to kind of keep that in mind. But yeah, so a couple of thoughts right away that I have on this passage is trying to, Jesus is taking the standards in the Old Testament, and he's in one of two ways. He is kind of showing like a new view on that, and he's also elevating the standard beyond where it is.
Yes.
So he says, "You have heard it was said." Usually that's a classic way of Jesus saying, or referencing something from the Old Testament. And he said, "You shall not commit adultery." That's from the Decalogue or the Ten Commandments. So the passage on adultery. He says, "But I say to you." So there's this contrast between you have heard it was said, this, the commandment that he's referring to, but I say to you. So he's superseding it in a sense where he's elevating the standard beyond what we're used to thinking, whether it's its historical understanding or its direct understanding in the text.
Yeah, correct. And this passage comes from Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, which is probably one of the longest sermons that we have on record of Jesus. And like you said, it's him elevating the standard, or perhaps revealing the standard that was intended all along from the very beginning. He's obviously talking from a place of authority with these things, and with what you just drew the contrast with, you have heard it said this, but I say this, which is also alluding to Jesus being God incarnate. But anyway,
no, it's important.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's Yeah, so that's where this context comes from. The whole one of the themes around this passage, around this chapter, is the idea of Jesus taking the written law and almost revealing the intent of the founder of the law.
Right, right.
So,
no, absolutely, well said. The big verse that the article is centered around is primarily verse 28 in Matthew 5. But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. So what he's kind of doing here, from my analysis so far, he's saying that if you do X, it's just as bad as if you were to do Y. If you were to look at a woman lustfully, and we'll unpack that in a moment here, it's just as bad as if you were to commit one of the gravest sins in Old Testament law.
I would even take it a step further than that, though. Well, what I mean is that it's almost as though he was saying it takes X to do Y.
Oh, okay.
In the sense that it takes for you to lust after the woman in your heart to get to the actual act of adultery in and of itself.
Sure. So it's like the preliminary cause. Like, you're always going to have this before you do adultery.
Correct.
So it's just as bad as if you were to do it.
And if we acknowledge how sex works, more times than not, you've had sex in your mind with the individual way before you get to the bed.
Yep. So yeah, that's kind of the mindset I have about that. So some of the things I wanted to kind of walk through here is, for one, like we mentioned already, the passage or the article that we're referencing and doing a rebuttal to, which, by the way, there's a link in the description. If you want to read the article for yourself, I highly encourage it. But I kind of wanted to just kind of zoom out a little bit and understand how the Bible in general takes pornography, or the Greek term porneia in general, because I think what the danger can be here, and I do want to give a defense inside of the Sermon on the Mount, but I also want to just survey the Bible in general to kind of give us a backdrop, because the Sermon on the Mount isn't divorced from the New Testament, it isn't divorced from the Old Testament, it isn't divorced from the historicity of the church and the tradition of the church, so it's all nested together within that. And the Christian insistence is that Jesus ultimately is the primary cause and author of sacred scripture in general. So if Paul writes something, yes, Paul wrote it, but it was inspired, and the primary author is supposed to be Christ. So all of Christ's teaching is going to be throughout the whole Bible in general. So I know you kind of did like a word survey on the term porneia. What was some of the things you came up with that?
Yeah, so the term pornography, its rooting is in Greek, and it almost comes directly to us from the Greek word pornographos or pornographos. I don't know how to. My Greek's terrible, but it is comprised of the Greek words porne, which means prostitute, or porneia, meaning fornication or prostitution, and then there's the word graphene. It's spelled GRAPHEIN, and it means to write. So it quite literally gives us the idea of writing about prostitutes.
Oh, wow.
And so the term porneia is derived from the Greek word porneo, which means to sell off. So effectively understood, porneia can be defined as the selling off of sexual purity, or the selling off of sexuality, the selling off of one's body for sexual use. In a figurative sense, throughout the biblical narrative, porneia is also used to describe spiritual unfaithfulness or spiritual adultery. This can be found in Ezekiel and in Revelation. And in a spiritual sense, it can be defined as the selling off of one's devotion to God, right? But then the question becomes, selling it off in exchange for what?
Interesting.
And so that's... And I guess, though, there are three things that, typically speaking, we find in Scripture that we sell off our devotion to God for, and it's usually the lust of the eye, lust of the flesh, and the pride of life, in some way, shape, or form. And then the term porneia is also used to identify other forms of sexuality or sexual immorality, in particular. That would include adultery, fornication, homosexuality, bestiality. These would all be considered porneia. In the Greek understanding. And then, so looking at it from that standpoint, and bringing that to a modern idea of pornography.
Okay.
Pornography is, in theory, the depiction or picture, word, or other forms of media of those willing to be paid for their own sexual exploitation. Mm-hmm. And that's what pornography is.
Boom, brought it full circle.
Well, there's another idea as well. There's another aspect of the definition of porneia, that's idolatry as well.
Interesting.
Which, if you factor that in, when you look at a lot of the different worldviews or religions that have formed themselves over time, particularly where man is the object of worship. Okay. Typically, there is sexuality involved in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah, no, we totally see that.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, porneia is also used to describe sex in that aspect as well. It's a form of idolatry. It's a form of worshiping oneself. It's a form of worshiping the creation rather than the creator.
Yeah, no, that makes total sense.
Yep.
So I think we have a good in the Sermon on the Mount context and out of the Sermon on the Mount context to kind of view this passage. So let's get to the article in general. I took some citation from Ben's article, and I'll just kind of read them, that we can kind of discuss each one. There's 4 primary points that we're kind of grabbing from. So in Ben's article, it says, the first point that he makes is that few porn consumers actually intend or plan to have sex with porn actresses, much less with actresses, or I can't read today, with actresses whose porn they consume. They only think about, imagine, or desire sex with the actresses. Thus, even if Matthew 28 is true, much porn consumption doesn't involve lustful intent, and so may not involve mental adultery.
And to which point, before we get started, I would say, now Ben. Like, come on, dude. Like, come on now. It's just fellas talking. It's just me and you. Come on, man. Come on, dude. Go ahead, man.
So let's work through this a little bit here. Basically, to re-sum up the argument is, people watch pornography doesn't necessarily entail that they're sexually attracted to the individual or would want to have sexual relations with that individual. So I guess my question is, like, what do you mean by that? Because a man can say something, but I'm way more concerned about what a man does rather than what he says.
Agreed.
Right? So is the intention to not sleep with them because you're incapable of sleeping with them? Because, I mean, obviously, you don't have direct access to these individuals socially. You don't know them personally. So obviously, you can't have sex with them. We don't want to just pretend that this is a moral virtue. Oh, I'm just sexually simulating my sex organs while watching them have sex with someone else. I would never want to have sexual relations with this individual. I fear it's a lot more of a social cut off, not necessarily, I just would prefer not to.
Yeah, and Ben's also implying too that before I had sex with this individual who I stimulate my sex organs to, I would ask them if they were married first.
Oh, we haven't even gotten there yet.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, no, that's one of the other points.
But that's kind of where he's going with this whole thing. And I know we didn't get there because that's one of the other points, but it just, yeah. Come on, man.
So I guess so that's one thing is it not, so the actions itself, because when I see someone sexually stimulating themselves to material, it implies that they get some sort of sexual gratification out of it. And so if you are sexually gratified and you are sexually completing the act and you're consuming this content while you're doing so, I mean, all of the actions are pointing to a high probability that you are at the very least sexually attracted to the images on screen.
At least you wouldn't have them on the screen.
Right. Otherwise, you would just be doing it to a wall or something. You wouldn't really need those images.
Right.
So that's one thing I would kind of bring up. The other point is, do people only masturbate to people they wouldn't want to have sex with? That seems absurd.
Absolutely.
Are you saying, like, most people only watch porn with people they would never have sex with and they aren't attracted to? Doesn't really seem to make a lot of sense, because it seems like there aren't a lot of, like, overweight or unattractive, like, porn stars and stuff like that. Typically, just from a general sense, we could just say they're more physically fit and generally attractive, just from if you just look at a surface analysis of what you think of like a porn star to look with in terms of like the cultural association with that, it's usually not a 500-pound, person who's ugly.
Although
there's some, don't get me wrong, but that's not what the typical person is. And so if the giant status quo for that is the opposite, it tends to lead towards the obvious implication is, well, people are sexually attracted to them. That's why they're sexually gratifying themselves while watching this content.
Correct.
So maybe the person who wrote this article, Ben, is just like the 1 out of a billion people who is like that. But I think for the average person who's being honest, obviously you're watching it because you're attracted to the individual. And maybe on some level, you'd be like, ew, I don't want to actually have sex with them. But I mean, like, all of your actions are pointing in a different direction.
Yeah.
And so,
I mean, this is, when I read the article and I saw this point, I'm just like, come on, man.
It makes me think of like Tiger Woods, for example. So many people gave him crap for cheating on his wife with all these like Swedish supermodels.
Sure.
And it's funny because it's from a lot of guys who have never been in that sort of level of temptation. And just for the record, I'm not saying what Tiger Woods did was okay. It was a terrible thing. Adultery in a general sense is always wrong.
Absolutely.
And so we'll just put that disclaimer out there. But people were approaching him, especially men, as if they were in Tiger Woods' exact situation, that they would be morally virtuous. Like, oh yeah, obviously I would resist 10 Swedish supermodels just like coming at me all the time. Obviously, because I'm so morally virtuous. And it's really easy to be morally virtuous when you're not in a place of serious temptation.
Yeah, so, yeah, absolutely, 1,000%.
It just seems very closely connected with that. Someone could say the same thing and be like, "Oh, I would never have sex with this porn star," but all of a sudden you're at a situation where all of a sudden you have these attractive women hitting on you. All of a sudden, especially if you're a single guy,
or if you have access to the porn stars that you view online. And that's where the moral virtue comes in. It's not morally virtuous if the temptation is never presented itself or made itself manifest in front of you, right? Yeah, it's just the idea that I wouldn't do this hypothetically. That's all it is hypothetical.
Yeah, and I'm more concerned about actions than I am about words.
Right.
So I think we've said enough on that. I think in a little bit, when it seems right, we're going to talk about different citations that brought together from like commentaries in the book of Matthew and from church fathers and stuff like that.
Yeah, you said second point.
Second point from our friend Ben here in the article is the second is that even if a porn consumer did intend to have sex with a porn actress, that would only amount to adulterous intent if the consumer or the actress were presumed to be married.
Ben. What are we doing? Like, come on, man. Come on. Like, and then on top of that, if this porn actress is a married woman, she is effectively committing adultery on camera anyway.
Yeah. So at the very least, you're like, I don't know if you'd be what's the word I'm looking for?
I don't know.
Assist in a crime.
An accomplice?
Accomplice, yeah. You're not technically an accomplice, but you're certainly enjoying the crime taking place.
Sure.
The moral crime.
Yeah. So it doesn't even make any sense. She's already committing adultery anyway. What's one more?
And so I guess the logical outworking of this was Jesus saying, well, before you beat your meat to someone having sex with another man, just check if she's married. And it's okay if she's not.
Yeah, dude.
Like, that doesn't seem to make a lot of sense to me.
No.
So I guess this could be a good time to kind of reference one of our citations here. Is that, or let me take a look one more time here. Sorry, one second. I got my notes are a little bit jumbled here. And again, just reading his point, even if a porn consumer did intend to have sex with a porn actress, that would only amount to adulterous intent if the consumer or the actress were presumed to be married. So I guess my question would be, has the consistent interpretation been that this is only about married women, only about married parties in general? And from my understanding, that's just how no one has interpreted that, whether it's modern scholarship, whether it's the tradition of the church. So we can go through a couple of citations here that I have. So this first commentary I'm going to reference is from Craig Keener on his commentary on the book of Matthew.
Yep.
So it's two citations here. Jesus intensifies this commandment against adultery by extending it to the realm of thought, highlighting the importance of heart purity. His use of hyperbole, such as gouging out an eye, serves to stress the extreme measures required to avoid sin, reflecting the radical nature of the kingdom ethics Jesus promotes. And then he goes on to write, Jesus teaches in a graphic manner the value that God places on marital and premarital fidelity. It rules out fornication of the heart as well. So Craig Keener, a very notable biblical scholar, is making the very clear thing. This is not meant just for adultery per se. He's highlighting a sexual ethic to a higher standard, and again is kind of using what's considered the most dangerous sexual crime in the Bible, adultery, that is required of capital punishment, and so he's raising the bar up to that. So saying it's if you were to do this, it's just as bad as if you were to do that. Like we talked about. A shorter citation here I have is from Craig Blomberg's New American Commentary on the Book of Matthew. Adultery, usually referred to sexual relations by a married person with a partner other than his or her spouse. But verse 28 makes clear that Jesus is not limiting his commandments to married people, but speaking of sexual sin in general.
Right.
So again, Craig Blomberg is making this obvious implicate or laying out the obvious implication of the text here that Jesus is heightening the standard. He's not just making adultery a little bit harder to overcome. He's raising the sexual ethic in general.
Right.
And then I'll give one more commentary reference. It's from General Article's commentary on the Book of Matthew by Clifton J. Allen. Jesus saw adultery as sin against any women, not married parties or anything like that, but specifically any women.
Right.
As something destructive to the offender, to the offended, and to marriage, and as, first of all, matter of attitude and intention. So he's saying that this sin isn't even just bad against women necessarily. It's destructive to the person committing the offense, the one being offended by the situation, and to marriage. Not the marriage, but to marriage, the institution wholesale.
Right.
So it's a sin against the concept of marriage in general. So those are a few of the citations I kind of wanted to bring up, that this viewpoint is just not.
Wait, if we kind of like hang there for a second, like I like that idea you brought up, like that it's a sin to the institution of marriage, because if it's a sin to that, then I suppose in a way it's a threat to the order of governance that God established in the beginning in the garden, right? Because marriage was the first form of order or government or human institutional relationship that he established. And so to have sex outside of that establishment is a direct threat against it, or a direct what I want to call it,
direct attack.
Yeah, sure, attack. There we go. A direct attack against the order that he established at the beginning. And it, like you said, it's not just to this marriage in particular, but to the entire institution. And I guess you can see that played out in examples where a husband and wife are married with children, and one of the spouses step out on the other one, and the damage that does to the family, and the children, the hurt that the children experience, and the damage that they experience when that situation is played out. A lot of people don't recover from that. As a matter of fact, there are people who won't get married because of what their parents did with that institution.
Wow.
And that attack that took place, right?
Yeah.
Because of what,
like, why get married? Look what it leads to.
Yeah, look at what mom did to dad, or look at what dad did to mom. And that led to them splitting apart and all of these other things, So I can see that play out with the institution as a whole being attacked, not just my personal marriage.
Right. No, great thoughts on that. I appreciate that.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, we could also reference some of the early church fathers if you're interested in what their thoughts were.
I like that.
So we have some sort of modern biblical scholarship on this topic, but this is also a consistent viewpoint and interpretation throughout the history of the church. One notable figure would be Saint Jerome. I believe he was around in roughly the 4th century of the early church. And the context here is Jerome doesn't ever make the distinction that this is only about married women. He also makes the distinction but he does make a distinction between pre-passion and passion. And that's something we actually haven't really talked a whole lot about, because there's a giant difference between walking down the street and noticing someone else is attractive and then going about your day. You could be like, oh, that's an attractive person, and then you could move right along. One of the other ways to, sorry about that, excuse me. But basically, it's a big, giant difference between noticing someone's attractive and then engaging in those thoughts more heavily and starting to seduce them in your mind, undress them in your mind, and stuff like that. So there's a giant difference here, and actually Jerome lays that out, but he labels the terms pre-passion versus passion. So basically, a look and noticing something versus indulging in the thought and going into a whole other rabbit trail of like sexually undressing someone in their mind and everything. So that's a little bit of the context there.
Absolutely.
But basically, the citation I have from St. Jerome on his commentary on the book of Matthew is this. Therefore, whoever looks upon a woman and his spirit becomes stimulated has been struck by pre-passion. But if he consents and makes an affection out of the thought, then it has passed from pre-passion to passion. He goes on to say, whoever then looks upon a woman to lust, that is, he looks in order to lust, so that he is disposed to act, that one rightly is said to have committed adultery with her in his heart. So he's making that distinction between noticing someone's attractive is different than actually going to full lengths, like sexually undress someone in their mind and start to have sexual fantasies and stuff like that. But then he makes it very clear that he's talking about women full sail, and it's just as bad as if you were to commit adultery with her in your heart. There's no distinction about the women here being a married person or any indication. You would have said a wife or something like that, or something more qualified.
You want to go back to some of the reasons? You want to do reasons 3 and 4?
Yeah, we can come back to these other church father citations if we feel like it.
Yeah.
So the other couple of objections we have here is, I'm going to kind of combine these because they're bridging. All of these are kind of building off of each other, but I feel like our response is going to be similar to these two, so we'll just bridge them together. So points 3 and 4 read as such. Even if the consumer intended to have sex with a porn actress who happened to be married, adulterous intent couldn't fairly be ascribed to that consumer unless they had sufficient reason to suspect that actress was married. Matthew, and then he goes on to say in his fourth point, Matthew 5:28's utility for anti-porn purposes is limited even if the consumer intended to have sex with an actress whom the consumer had enough reason to suspect was married to someone other than the consumer, of course. Adulterous intent couldn't be fairly ascribed unless the consumer intended to have sex with the actress during her marriage to someone else. If the consumer only intended to have sex with that woman after her marriage ended, they could not be accused of mental adultery.
Which I'm so glad that Ben gives far more credit to porn users than we do. I'm really glad he does that, because I mean, the
a lot of credit.
The amount of effort that it takes to come up with these reasons to make pornography okay. I mean, this is insane.
I've never heard of anyone being like, yeah, I always make sure you check out that she's married before you engage in pornography.
Please
Otherwise,
verify that.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. Or maybe like if she is married, like DM her husband first.
Like ask if it's okay.
I mean, dude, like.
Yo, by the way.
Right, real quick, I wanted to watch this.
Is that cool? Which I don't think he's necessarily saying that, but it is kind of funny to lay it out like that. And I feel like a lot of this we've already kind of addressed. Jesus is not talking about married women specifically. He's talking about women wholesale.
Right.
And we'll talk more about that in general in a moment here. And yeah, I mean, any other thoughts in general about this sort of passage of points 3 and 4? Maybe something we hadn't touched that's specific in this part?
No, I think that we kind of pointed out all of the issues with these ideas. And when you think about how porn gets used, when you think about the type of porn that exists on the internet, you see very quickly here that these types of thoughts are not ascribed to people who faithfully engage in the act, right? Yeah, that's just not what's going on.
Sure. So here are some potential objections someone might have to our video that I was kind of anticipating. Some from research, some from just brainstorming on my own. First one here, the Greek term gynaika, can't really pronounce that. Let's hope that was right. Close enough. The term used for women is limited to only or primarily married women. Therefore, it is only a sinful act if one is looking at a married woman lustfully. So we've talked about that from a general interpretation of the church. We have more citations we can get to if we need to. But that's an interesting thing. It's looking directly at the passage itself. It's saying, well, if you survey the whole Bible, when the Greek term for women is used, it's almost always referring to married parties. So it can't be about something outside of adultery per se.
Right.
The sexual ethic that Jesus is teaching is specifically to adultery, not to a sexual ethic in general. And so here's the problem with this. When you actually do a survey of the New Testament in general, we notice that the Greek word is in fact used for wife sometimes.
Sure.
In fact, it's used over 80 times to refer to someone as a wife or something approximating to it. But the problem is the exact same Greek word, when you do a survey using like a Greek concordance or something, is also in fact used for women 130 times.
Just in general.
Any kind of woman,
right.
whether it's talking about women generally or a specific woman, makes no reference to them being a married party. And you could refer to virgins as a woman as well.
Right.
So you can see my point right there. So not to mention though, in the book of Matthew, the same author who wrote Matthew, in that same document, used the word to mean both women generally or women who are wives. So he's using the word intentionally in the two different categories. So he's well aware of the word and is using it in these different ways. So you'd have to make a stronger case that it's specifically that. And I feel like we've kind of already shown that no one has thought this way. People who actually spoke the Greek language, like the early church fathers, never viewed this passage in that way.
Correct.
Any other thoughts on that objection?
No. I mean, that's like, once again, I mean, this whole exercise is just an exercise in trying to find the loophole.
Sure.
And so, these objections they're all of them are relatively shaky at best, but it's good to engage in the conversation in intellectually honest ways and address them. I know another one here we're looking at here, and I'd love to get what you think on this one is, if Jesus wanted to object to looking at women lustfully, then he should have used prostitution as a reference instead of adultery, as adultery only involves a married party.
Right, and I could totally see where someone's coming from with that. The problem is with prostitution in general is it's not sanctioned as a penalty or as a sin warranting capital punishment or the death penalty, where adultery is. And there's other sexual sins that do elicit the death penalty, but they wouldn't be as analogous, right? So like using bestiality would not be a good example to connect it here.
Right.
And we run into other issues with prostitution in general. So here are some of my other thoughts on it. Is again, Jesus is heightening the moral ethic here to a higher degree. He isn't equating the exactness of the sexual sin, but more so the concept. Adultery was considered the worst sexual sin to commit in terms of punishment. It was high up there.
Right.
And again, with its attack on the institution of marriages itself is a big thing to consider. So prostitution, though outlawed in the Old Testament, like in Deuteronomy 23, 17, and 18, it's almost never warranted the death penalty. Unless, of course, you were the daughter of a Levitical priest. If we use prostitution as an analogy, it would at best be confusing to Jesus' audience. The Levites were roughly 1/12 of the population, and priests could only be from the tribe of Levi.
Right.
So not every father at this point not every father was a priest. So that's a huge thing to consider.
Right.
So if Jesus was to use this analogy, it would be super confusing, because then using Leviticus 21:9, it would almost sound like if you look at a small subsection of the population with lust, i.e. the daughters of Levitical priests, then it is as if you committed prostitution. Or is it if you committed, because he's making a connection there.
Right.
So then that doesn't really seem to make a lot of sense. It sounds totally different than what we're accustomed to. Right. And it's clearly not getting to the point, even if we take Ben's interpretation from the beginning, he's clearly not saying this very small subset of the population and everything. So at best, it just makes it even more confusing and not clear. Again, to summarize, if you do X, it's as bad as if you were to do Y. If you look at a woman with lust, it is just as you committed what's considered one of the gravest sexual sins at the time, adultery. There's no qualifier that the woman that you're looking at is betrothed to or married to another. Because again, if you're engaged back then, you were treated as if you were a married couple, even though you had not officially been made a married couple.
Yeah. So. I got you. Okay, here goes another one then.
Okay.
So regulating moral thoughts such as lust encroaches on an individual's freedoms or privacy, right? Which is very interesting to consider.
Yeah.
That's an interesting objection. But it's one thing to legislate against actions that harm others, right? And I would actually make the case that pornography is harmful to people.
Right.
But quite another to police thoughts that harm no one.
Sure.
So how would you How would you respond to that objection?
Yeah, so I guess looking at the point of Jesus' teaching here in Matthew 5 is he's trying to get to the root cause of the problem.
Yes.
So if you just put if you just punish the end result of the problem, you're never going to finish it. So for example, if I have a mice infestation at my house, I could just kill the mice, right? It would get rid of the problem for now, but it's not going to get rid of the root of the problem and get rid of the problem wholesale. In order to get rid of the mice in my house, I need to plug up the holes. I need to properly fix the foundation of the house and make sure the mice can't get back in. And then I can kill the mice and everything. It's the same thing with any sort of sin that we commit. Just only focusing on the extrinsic act that we commit is not going to get rid of the root cause or the problem here. And so if we want to get rid of adultery, we have to stop looking at women lustfully and looking at them as objects, or just looking at them sexually when we're not supposed to.
Yeah, and I'm actually reminded of when I was a kid, when I would be at my father's house. Sometimes we would assist him with yard work, and one of the things that we would do is we would pull up weeds. And I remember there being a specific process to pulling up weeds. It wasn't like anything else in terms of what we would do, and in terms of like how you can just like cut it. That's what one would think. Oh, I'm just gonna cut it, and
it goes away.
Weed is gone. But then actually, if you look just a few weeks later, the weeds actually come back, and not only do they come back bigger than they were the first time. So, and the reason for that is because you have to pull them up by the root.
Right.
You have to get down on your knees and find the root of the weed, and then pull up. Now you've pulled it up. That takes work. That takes effort, and everything like you just said. You can get rid of the mice, set a mice trap, and catch it. But it's a whole other thing for you to grab a flashlight, get on your knees, look under the foundation of your house to try to find that's where they're coming in at, and address that.
Right.
As opposed to just mousetrap.
Exactly.
So
I think we got time for one more today. Let's do one more possible potential rebuttal or objection to what we said today.
Yep. You want me to do it?
Yeah.
Sure.
Sorry. I was trying to be slick.
Expecting individuals to never experience lustful thoughts is unrealistic and ignores basic human biology and psychology.
And, to some extent, I can kind of agree with that. And I think that's why we need grace.
Yeah, I agree with 1,000%.
So I don't think that anyone is capable of following the moral law, the Mosaic law, whatever it might be, perfectly. And that's, I think, why we have a Savior. That's why we have Jesus, because we do need his help. We do need his grace. And by his grace, we are able to live a better life in general. And so that's just something I would think about. I think now it depends also what this individual means, because I would not say a lustful thought is noticing someone's attractive and then just going on about your day.
Right.
It's a lustful thought to notice someone's attractive, start undressing them in your mind, and start having sexual fantasies.
Yes.
I do think someone, especially with grace, can stop engaging in that sort of sinful behavior.
Correct.
And the reason it's sinful behavior is not just because you're degrading the individual that you're looking at, but it's also an attack on the institution of what sexual morality is supposed to be through marriage in general. And it's going to lead you to start potentially committing more sexual sins down the road.
Yeah, and Paul also talks about how sexual immorality is actually one of the few sins where we actually sin against ourselves, and not just against God or against another person. So that's something worthy of consideration as well. And I certainly don't think here that we are saying that the expectation is to never have lustful thoughts or never experience lustful thoughts. I think what Jesus is trying to implement here is he's trying to express the necessity for managing one's lustful thoughts and how to manage one's lustful thoughts, which is treat them as soon as you possibly can. because if left unmanaged or left untreated, these things will grow into, they manifest into actual actions that will cause harm to not only you, the individual having them, the individual that you're lusting for, and you just have a big mess on your hands. And I think that that's what Jesus is ultimately getting at. It's not the experience of lustful thoughts; it's what to do when you get them. And if you don't manage them properly when you get them, this is where it's going to lead to.
Right.
It's going to lead to it going from just a thought or an idea in my head to an actual action that's being carried out, where the consequences are far more real than the fantasy that I was just playing out in my head.
Absolutely. Well said. So what do you guys think? Did we miss anything in the article? Again, you can read the whole thing in the description of this video. Let us know what you think in the comments, if we missed anything, if we should continue to talk about this topic of pornography in general. It's something I'm certainly interested in learning more about and studying in general, in terms of its effect on humanity, sort of biblical idea of porneia and things like that in general. Let me know what you guys think.
And real quick, speaking of effect on humanity, there was an article, and I'll have the link in the description, but there's an article that I read about with pornography and divorce rates, and how married couples where one or both spouses were engaging in pornography use, their likelihood of divorce doubled.
Oh, wow.
As opposed to those who didn't, which is very interesting to consider. But we'll include those links in the description. But until next time, I am your co-host, Jalen Thompson.
Dylan Schweitzer.
And as always, for the kingdom, we gone.